You can almost hear it. The palace is holding its breath. It's late in ancient Rome, not the busy, shouting Rome you see in paintings with chariots, loud traders, and toga parties. No, this is the quiet kind of Rome, the one that creeps in after sunset. The streets outside are almost empty. A few oil lamps flicker. Dogs bark somewhere in the distance, and on a hill, wrapped in shadows, stands the most powerful place in the empire, the palace of Emperor Caligula. Inside, everything looks calm. Calm, but not peaceful. The kind of calm that feels like it could shatter with one wrong step. Marble floors gleam in the moonlight. The air smells like burning oil, sweet wine, and too much perfume, because yes, even the hallways smell fancy here. And, in the middle of this silence, slaves are still working. There's no such thing as clocking out in Caligula's palace. The emperor might decide he wants a midnight snack, or a song, or something random. And if you're the one serving him, well, let's just say you'd better be awake and fast. The night shift here isn't like some quiet security guard job. It's a silent ballet of tired people trying to not be noticed. Sandaled feet pad softly over the cold marble floors. Nobody dares speak too loud. Even a sneeze could be the most dangerous sound of the night. A young slave, carrying a tray of fruit, pauses by a massive golden door. Behind it, somewhere deeper in the palace, Caligula is awake. That's enough to make everyone nervous. It's not because he's throwing a wild party. It's because no one ever really knows what kind of mood the emperor is in. Sometimes he's generous, handing out coins like candy. Sometimes he's not. So, every step tonight has to be careful, quiet, precise. Now, if you're imagining a dusty old building, forget that. Caligula's palace was next-level luxury. Think marble columns taller than trees, ceilings painted with gods staring down at you, and gold decorations everywhere. Even the walls looked expensive. But here's the thing. All that shine wasn't for the people working there. It was to make the emperor feel like the center of the universe. The slaves, they were like shadows, moving between the light. Seen, but not heard. Useful, but never safe. If you could walk the palace halls at this hour, you'd see all kinds of scenes. Down one hallway, a small group of kitchen slaves is preparing a plate. Why? Because maybe Caligula will wake up and decide he wants honeyed figs at 2 a.m. Who knows? One of them whispers, he better not ask for oysters again. Another elbows him, not because it's funny, but because joking out loud here is dangerous. Down another hallway, two guards stand at attention, trying to look serious, but mostly try not to fall asleep. A fly buzzes near one guard's face, and for a split second, he almost swats it. But then he remembers, any sudden noise might be noticed, so the fly wins this round. Somewhere in the dark, a slave girl carries a small oil lamp, her shadow dancing across the walls like a ghost. She knows every crack in these halls. She's walked this path 100 times, always with the same goal. Do the job, don't be noticed, survive the night. It's strange. For outsiders, the palace must look like heaven on earth. Golden statues, painted ceilings, endless feasts. But for the people inside, the workers, the slaves, it feels more like walking on thin ice. Except the ice is made of marble, and the man watching you is the Emperor of Rome. The sound of a door creaking makes everyone freeze. A servant holding a pitcher of wine almost drops it. A guard glances over his shoulder. The air seems to tighten. But it's nothing, just a draft. Still, everyone exhales quietly, like they've been holding their breath too long. That's what fear feels like here. It's not loud. It's quiet. It sits in your stomach, making you careful with every step. If you peeked into the emperor's private courtyard, you'd find torches still burning, their light flickering over carefully trimmed gardens. There's a fountain in the center, shaped like a god pouring water from a jug. And somewhere above, the moon watches it all like a silent guest. This is the strange beauty of the palace. It's gorgeous and terrifying at the same time. It's the kind of place where you can admire the view, but only if no one catches you looking too long. In one corner, an older slave sits on a small stool mending a torn piece of cloth by lamplight. He's been here for years. He's learned how to survive, not by being brave, but by being invisible. Palace doesn't love anyone, he once whispered to a new servant. It just uses us. He keeps his head down, fingers working quietly, ears always listening. Nearby, a younger boy scrubs a mosaic floor until his arms ache. It's pointless, really. The floor is already clean enough to eat off of. But work keeps your mind off trouble. And trouble here comes fast. The night in Caligula's palace is full of tiny sounds. A cloth brushing marble, the soft splash of a fountain, a candle crackling, footsteps so light they almost sound like whispers. It's peaceful, almost beautiful, until you remember why it's so quiet. Because nobody wants to be the sound that breaks it. A new servant, just arrived that week, walks a little too fast down the hallway. An older one hisses at him, "Slow down. Always slow down at night." The boy nods, his heart pounding. One careless moment can be remembered for a very long time here. And then, the sound that makes everyone stiffen up. A bell. Not loud, just a soft ring from the emperor's quarters. But it's enough to send ripples through the palace. The kitchen boys stop talking. The guards straighten their backs. A senior servant steps forward with calm she's practiced for years. "She's awake," she whispers. Nobody says anything else. They all know what that means. Maybe he just wants wine. Maybe he wants to walk through the gardens. Or maybe he's just bored. And when the emperor is bored, everyone has to be ready. That's the thing about serving a man like Caligula. His power isn't just in what he says. It's in the way everyone waits for it. One sound, one glance, one tiny change, and the whole palace moves. As the servants hurry silently toward the emperor's room, the palace comes alive again, but not like a party, more like a beehive that just got tapped. Quiet buzzing, fast movement, careful hands. The older slave with the cloth sighs and puts down his needle. "Here we go again," he mutters softly to no one in particular. Outside, the city of Rome sleeps. But in here, sleep is a luxury for people who don't live under an emperor's roof. And so the night goes on. The moon will cross the sky, the oil lamps will burn low, servants will keep walking, cleaning, carrying, waiting, hoping the night ends without someone getting blamed for something they didn't even do. Caligula's palace is gold on the outside and ice on the inside. A place where whispers are safer than words. A place where silence isn't peaceful, it's survival. So if you ever time-traveled to ancient Rome and thought, "Hey, working in the emperor's palace sounds fancy," think again. Sure, the floors shine and the walls are pretty, but one wrong move, and the only thing shining is the spotlight on you. Better to keep your head down and walk quietly. If you walked into Rome around the year of 39 CE, the first thing you'd probably say is, "Whoa!" The city was alive, loud, crowded, full of smells you could never quite describe, but would definitely remember. This wasn't a sleepy ancient village. Rome was the capital of an empire that stretched across continents. It was like the main character of the ancient world. But while everyone else saw shining temples, fancy statues, and endless bread markets, behind it all sat one man, the emperor. And not just any emperor, Caligula. Now, Caligula didn't start out as the scary name you read in history books. In fact, in the beginning, he was kind of adored. People cheered for him. Soldiers loved him. The Senate pretended to love him. And the people of Rome, they thought, finally, a good one. Yeah, about that. When Caligula first took the throne in 37 CE, the city buzzed with hope. His father, Germanicus, had been a war hero. His family was famous, and Caligula himself, he was young, charming, and surprisingly good at smiling in public. People even gave him the nickname Caligula, which means little boots, because when he was a kid, he used to run around in a tiny soldier's outfit. Cute, right? Well, that cuteness didn't last forever. Once he got the big chair, the imperial throne, something changed. Historians still argue what exactly happened. Illness, power rush, stress? Or maybe he was always like that and just finally got the chance to be himself. Either way, Rome soon found out that their emperor wasn't exactly a chill guy. Let's set the stage a bit. Rome under Caligula was huge. Over 1 million people crammed into the city. The streets were full of traders, soldiers, farmers, shopkeepers, beggars, and of course, slaves. If you stood on a street corner, you'd hear a mix of Latin, Greek, Egyptian, and languages you didn't even know existed. It was a busy empire capital, kind of like New York, but with more sandals and fewer traffic lights. Big temples rose above narrow streets, rich nobles held parties in their villas, markets stayed open late, and the Tiber River flowed right through the heart of it, carrying boats loaded with goods from across the empire. But in the middle of all that noise, one place towered over everything: the Palatine Hill, where the imperial palace sat like a golden spiderweb. If the emperor moved, the whole city felt it. Caligula loved making people see how powerful he was. He built expensive things. He hosted massive events. He did stuff just because he could. If someone said, "That's impossible," Caligula said, "Hold my wine." For example, he had a bridge built across the Bay of Baiae just so he could ride his horse across it, wearing armor. Because why not? He also decorated the palace with gold and marble like he was trying to win an ancient version of Most Extra Emperor of the Year. This might sound fun, if you were Caligula, but for everyone else, especially those who worked for him, this meant endless stress. Life for normal Romans was a mix of busy, noisy, and dangerous. There were fancy banquets for the rich, but also overcrowded apartments for the poor. Fires broke out all the time because buildings were made of wood. The streets were dirty and, let's just say, indoor plumbing was a dream for most people. For slaves and servants, though, life wasn't just tough, it was controlled. Every law, every tax, every whisper from the palace could change their day. If the emperor decided he wanted more food at his table, well, someone out there would have to work twice as hard to make it happen. Caligula ruled like the world revolved around him, and in Rome, it kind of did. The Senate, the group of old men in togas who were supposed to help run things, didn't really stand a chance. Caligula liked to remind them who was in charge. Some stories say he mocked senators during meetings. Other times, he ignored them completely. If this were a modern office, he'd be the boss who makes everyone sit in a meeting and then does all the talking himself, loudly. The soldiers, though, they liked him at first. He gave them money, gifts, and put on a big show of being a military guy. But later, even they started to get nervous. His decisions got stranger, his temper got shorter, and everyone around him learned the golden rule. When Caligula's in a mood, just smile and nod. Meanwhile, the palace became a world of its own. If the streets of Rome were noisy and chaotic, the palace was polished and silent. But it wasn't the calm kind of silence. It was the tense kind, like the moment right before a thunderstorm. Servants and slaves lived in constant alert mode. If Caligula laughed too loud, that wasn't funny. It might mean trouble for someone. If he suddenly got quiet, also trouble. Basically, breathing wrong could be a bad idea if he noticed. But what made Caligula's rules so chilling wasn't just what he did, it was how unpredictable he was. Rome had known strict emperors before. Rome had known cruel emperors before. But Caligula? He liked to keep everyone guessing. One day he'd hand out gifts, the next he'd yell at a senator for looking too serious. People never quite knew if they were safe or next. Even the people who lived far from the palace felt it, because when the emperor wanted something, the whole empire had to deliver. Bread prices changed. New buildings funded by taxes. Extra work, you bet. And let's not forget the entertainment. Romans loved their games. Chariot races, gladiator fights, theater. Caligula loved showing off at these events, sitting in his fancy imperial box like a superstar. People cheered because they wanted to, and also because not cheering wasn't really an option. To keep the crowd happy, he threw public games that lasted days. While people were busy watching horses race around the Circus Maximus, he was making political moves in the background. It's the oldest trick in the book. Keep the crowd entertained, and they'll stay quiet. Now, not everyone hated him at first. Remember, in the beginning, many Romans adored Caligula. He threw big celebrations, canceled some unpopular taxes, and acted like everyone's cool new emperor. But as his rule went on, that shine started to fade. People whispered, senators complained, quietly, and even loyal guards began to look over their shoulders. This is the Rome that palace slaves lived in, a city where everything sparkled on the outside, but everyone on the inside walked carefully. A city where power sat in one man's hands, and those hands were unpredictable. So as the city of Rome looked alive and powerful under the moonlight, the truth was simple. The emperor's mood decided everything. If Caligula laughed, Rome laughed. If he frowned, well, let's just say nobody wanted to find out what came after that. By the end of this chapter, the palace we visited in the dark now has a wider shadow. It's not just a single building with golden doors. It's the beating heart of a whole empire. And inside that heart sits a man who loves power maybe a little too much. For the people serving him, that meant living in a world that looked beautiful, but felt like a trap. And tomorrow night, the lamps will burn again, the palace will whisper again, and Rome will hold its breath. Let's step away from the palace for a moment. Before anyone ever scrubbed those shiny marble floors or carried trays of figs at 2 a.m. or whispered in those long hallways, they had to get there first. And for many, that journey started in a place that looked nothing like gold. It started in a slave market. Now, if you're picturing a calm little shop with price tags and polite salesmen, no. The Roman slave market was loud, crowded, and smelled like a mix of sweat, sand, and someone's lunch that's been sitting out too long. This was where human lives were bought and sold like furniture. No soft music, no customer service, just auctions, shouting, and a lot of fear. The market usually sat in busy city areas. Rome itself had several, and one of the most famous was near the Forum, the same forum where senators walked around trying to look important. Merchants stood under big wooden platforms. People were herded in lines. Buyers, rich nobles, traders, even palace officials walked up and down, pointing, asking questions, like they were picking out a new couch. Except, of course, these weren't objects. They were people. Some were prisoners of war, captured when Rome expanded into other lands. Others were born into slavery, never even knowing a different life. Some were kidnapped from faraway places. Their languages, clothes, and faces were different, but once they got here, they were all treated the same. If you stood in the crowd, you'd hear the auctioneer's voice cutting through the noise. Strong young man, good for lifting and carrying. Skilled cook, knows how to make bread that doesn't burn. And sometimes, knows how to read and write. The last one? That cost extra. Rich households, and yes, the imperial palace, sent their people to these markets to pick out new hands. They looked for strength, beauty, skill, or sometimes just someone who could follow orders without talking back. The sad truth? Nobody asked the people being sold what they wanted. Let's imagine one of these days. A young woman from Gaul, that's modern France, stands on the platform. She doesn't understand Latin. The auctioneer lifts her arm to show she's healthy. People in the crowd look at her like they're shopping for apples. One man strokes his beard, another raises a hand to bid. She doesn't know who's shouting what, only that each shout pushes her future further away from home. Beside her, a boy, barely 16, shifts from foot to foot. He's from Greece. A merchant explains in broken Latin, "Strong back, good worker." A palace official watches silently. He has a list. Someone like him will decide which faces will end up serving inside those golden halls. The market didn't stop just because someone was scared. Business kept moving. Coins changed hands fast. Papers were signed. New owners led their new servants away. And just like that, a life changed. Sometimes families were split in seconds. A mother sold to one household, a child sold to another. And because Rome didn't exactly have a customer complaint desk, those families rarely saw each other again. For the palace, the process was almost organized. Cold, but organized. They looked for different kinds of people. Strong men for heavy labor, skilled cooks, cleaners with quick hands. A few well-educated slaves were chosen to work in closer contact with the emperor's world, writing, reading, managing household details. If your skills were rare, maybe you ended up working near the top. If not, you scrubbed floors. A lot. But, and this is the tricky part, working for the palace wasn't automatically better. It sounded fancy, sure, but once you were inside, you lived under the emperor's moods. And Caligula's moods? Yeah, they could switch faster than a street performer changing hats. Most people didn't know where they were being sent. They just followed the man holding the rope or the chain or the stick. A merchant might say, "You're lucky, palace job." But lucky is a word that can mean a lot of things. On the way to the palace, some whispered prayers in their own language. Others stayed quiet. Some cried. Others looked numb. They'd seen enough to know what was coming. Let's take a little detour to understand something important. Slavery in Rome was a huge part of the economy. By some counts, slaves made up nearly a third of the population. They cooked, built, cleaned, taught, farmed, carried, entertained, and basically kept everything running. The empire ran on their backs, not that anyone thanked them for it. And because there were so many, the markets never silenced. There was always someone arriving from somewhere. A new war, a new batch of prisoners, a new boat docking at the Tiber River. This was a system, a cold, efficient machine. Sometimes slave traders tried to make the experience seem more professional. They'd paint signs on people, strong, healthy, educated. Or they'd make them walk in circles so buyers could see them from all sides. Imagine being treated like you're in some kind of contest you never signed up for. It wasn't about who you were, just what you could do. A palace buyer might tap someone's shoulder, lift their arm, inspect their teeth, ask questions. If they liked what they saw, they'd pay the price.
No interviews, no warm welcome, just a nod, a deal, a life changed. The funny, or rather not funny, but strange thing, is that some Romans actually saw buying slaves as a sign of class. Like, oh, you have 5 servants? I have 12. I'm richer than you. It was their way of showing off. And the palace, well, they were the biggest show-off of all. If a rich noble could have a dozen servants, the emperor could have hundreds. By sunset, the market slowly quieted. The merchants counted their coins, buyers returned to their estates or to the palace, and the people who'd been sold disappeared down different streets, headed for different lives. Some might end up cooking for a senator. Some would be working in workshops. Some would be building roads. And just a few, would walk through the palace gates, not knowing what waited on the other side. For those palace-bound servants, the golden walls weren't welcoming. They were high and cold. They didn't whisper home. They whispered, be careful. Still, they followed, because what else could they do? When we think of the Roman Empire, we often imagine emperors, battles, or giant statues. But the real story of Rome was also written in places like this, noisy, crowded slave markets, where ordinary people had their futures decided in seconds. It's easy to look at ancient ruins today and think everything was grand. But behind every marble column, there were lives like these, pulled from homes, forced into service, trying to survive in a world that didn't give them a choice.
So, before the palace marble floors ever gleamed, and before Caligula ever rang his little bell for a midnight drink, it all began here, in a noisy market, with tired feet and quiet fear. Next time you hear about emperors living like gods, remember the people who had to polish their golden floors. Picture this. You've just been sold at the slave market. The sun's beating down, the dust is sticking to your skin, and the merchant's voice still rings in your ears. And then you hear it. You've been picked for the palace. Now, most people at the market would probably gasp at that. Working in the emperor's palace? Sounds fancy, right? Golden halls, marble floors, sparkling fountains, maybe a chance to sneak an extra fig or two. But here's the twist. Being chosen for the palace wasn't a dream. It was a gamble. The palace was like a big, beautiful cage. It looked pretty from the outside, but once you were in, every step could be dangerous. When Caligula's people showed up at the market, they didn't yell or wave around bags of coins. They were calm, silent. That actually made it scarier. A palace official might walk slowly through the crowd, a few guards behind him, scanning faces like a cat scanning a line of mice. He'd point at someone, the merchant would nod, a deal would be made. No explanation needed. And just like that, you were tagged as palace property. There was a strange kind of status to it, though. Regular households bought people to work in kitchens, fields, or shops, but the palace? That was top tier. It meant you were going to serve the emperor's world. Not the emperor himself, not usually, but everything around him. Some people in the crowd actually thought, hey, maybe this is better than being stuck cleaning some senator's dusty boots. And sometimes, yeah, they were right, but not always. Because the palace came with rules, lots of them. The chosen ones were taken away from the market in small groups. Sometimes they were put on wagons, sometimes they walked. If they got lucky, they got water on the way. The palace wasn't exactly down the street. It was a grand, massive place built to impress and intimidate. From far away, it looked like something out of a dream. Huge walls, towers, statues that made you feel small. The gates weren't just doors, they were statements. They said, you're entering another world now. And that world belonged to one man, Caligula. Before stepping inside, new arrivals went through a sort of check-in. Think of it like an ancient, very unfriendly job orientation. First, their names were either recorded or replaced with new names. Roman names were easier to say, after all, so if your name was complicated, poof, new name. You might have been Dionysia yesterday, but today you're Livia. Then you were assigned a rank. Some people became kitchen workers, some cleaners, some messengers, some personal attendants. Those with special skills like writing, counting, or singing might get placed in higher positions. But higher didn't always mean safer. The palace slaves lived in a bubble. Everything they saw, everything they said, everything they did had to stay inside those walls. If gossip leaked out, bad news. So people learned to keep their heads down, their lips sealed, and their ears open. One wrong word could put you in trouble. And trouble, in Caligula's palace, was the last thing anyone wanted. But here's the strange part. Even with all the fear, the palace ran like a machine. Everyone had a role. Everyone had to keep the emperor's world spinning smoothly. There were cooks up at dawn, scrubbing floors before the sun touched the marble. Gardeners trimming plants that didn't even need trimming. Messengers running up and down halls like they were in an Olympic race. Caligula liked things just so. And when the emperor liked things a certain way, you didn't argue. You just nodded and got to work. The palace also had layers. Not everyone got to see everything. Lower-ranked servants stayed near kitchens, storerooms, laundry areas. Mid-ranked ones cleaned halls or worked in gardens. The top few, the ones with trusted skills, might get closer to the emperor's chambers or his private parties. Most people never saw Caligula directly. They just felt his moods in the air, like the weather. If he was in a good mood, the halls felt lighter. If he wasn't, everyone walked a little faster and spoke a little less. Now you might be wondering, did anyone want to work at the palace? Believe it or not, some did. Not because they liked serving emperors, but because, compared to other places, palace work could mean regular food, a roof, and maybe fewer random punishments from cranky landowners. Also, if you were clever, sometimes you could work your way up, become trusted, get better clothes, a little more freedom inside the walls. Not actual freedom, of course, but a softer version of being stuck. Among the chosen, little friendships formed, whispered conversations while cleaning silver trays, silent nods in long hallways. You couldn't trust everyone, but having someone to share a quiet joke with could make a hard day a tiny bit easier. Some learned to move like shadows, quiet, careful, blending in. The less attention you got, the safer you were. In Caligula's palace, being invisible could be a kind of superpower. Of course, there was always the pressure. The emperor could walk down a hallway any time. An official could call your name out of nowhere, and you had to be ready. Smile, bow, do your job. Even if your feet hurt, even if your heart was pounding. The palace wasn't a place where people lived their own lives. It was a place where they lived his. What made it even trickier was the gossip. Oh yes, the palace had a lot of whispers. People passing rumors quietly like they were handing around warm bread. Who got promoted? Who got in trouble? Who saw the emperor's pet elephant do something weird? But everyone knew the rule. Gossip was for the shadows, not for the open air. Say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and those marble walls would feel very cold very fast. For new arrivals, the first few days were a blur, learning where things were, when to wake up, who to avoid, how to bow just right. If you messed up, someone would remind you, not kindly, but clearly. And slowly, the palace would shape you. You'd walk differently, talk differently, think differently. Because in there, survival wasn't about being strong, it was about being smart. Caligula's palace was more than just a building. It was like a living creature. It had a heartbeat, the footsteps in the halls. It had a voice, the murmurs of servants, and it had eyes. Everywhere. Being chosen to serve here felt like being handed a golden cup, but drink too fast and you'd choke. Hold it too tightly and it'd slip. It was a dangerous honor. Some survived, some didn't. But for the people brought through those gates, there really wasn't a choice. They didn't ask to be chosen. The palace decided for them. And now, their lives belonged to marble floors, echoing halls, and a man whose moods ruled everything. So, what was a typical day like for someone stuck, working in Caligula's palace? Spoiler, it wasn't all lazing around and admiring statues. Palace life was like living inside a very shiny clock. Everyone had a job, and that job had to tick at just the right time. The palace woke up early, really early, like roosters is still snoring. The marble halls were quiet, except for the shuffle of sandals and the soft sound of brooms. Even the statues seemed sleepy. But the servants? No such luck. The first group up were the cleaners. They swept the halls, polished bronze lamps, and wiped down marble floors that somehow got dirty overnight. Maybe marble has a secret hobby of attracting dust. Nobody ever figured it out.
Then came the kitchen crew. These people were basically the palace engine. Before the emperor yawned his first yawn of the day, bread was already baking, honey was being drizzled, and pots of something warm were bubbling away. And no, it wasn't cereal. Romans loved their food a little fancy. Kitchen slaves had to move fast, but silent. Nobody wanted Caligula to wake up to burnt bread. A cranky emperor was bad news for everyone. While all this happened, messengers started their day too. These were the runners of the palace. Literally. They sprinted up and down the corridors with scrolls, little notes, or sometimes just verbal messages like, "He wants grapes, now." Their job wasn't glamorous, but it was important. In a palace that big, if someone didn't deliver a message, the entire rhythm could fall apart. Next came the water carriers, the gardeners, the launders, the animal keepers, because yes, emperors loved their pets, and candle lighters. Everyone had a role. Everyone moved like bees in a hive. What made it tricky was that not everyone worked in the same spaces. Lower-rank servants stayed in back corridors, out of sight, out of mind. Mid-rank workers might be seen passing through gardens or hallways. Only a few ever went near the emperor's chambers. Around mid-morning, Caligula usually stirred, and when the emperor was awake, well, the palace changed temperature. Not literally, but it felt like it. Guards straightened their backs, officials adjusted their robes, servants moved quicker. Because if the emperor walked down a hallway, everything had to look perfect. Like you could eat off the floor perfect. Not that anyone should try that. The attendants closest to his wing had to be extra sharp. They never knew if he'd want music, food, or a random walk through the gardens. Serving the emperor was a game of guessing what he wanted before he said it. Midday was a busy time. Meals were served, guests sometimes arrived, and the palace was at full buzz. Cooks plated dishes like they were making art. Cleaners swept invisible crumbs. If Caligula decided to throw a mini feast, well, then everyone's schedule exploded. For the slaves working there, it was like running a race that never ended. You didn't get to pause and say, "Can I take a break?" Because the palace didn't run on breaks. It ran on orders. But here's the funny thing. Even with all the chaos, some people got really good at their routines. They knew which hallways to take to avoid bumping into guards. They knew how to slip through kitchens without dropping a single plate. They even knew the exact sound of footsteps coming from a grumpy official. Over time, the palace became like a map in their heads, a map they walked every day, eyes down, mouth shut. Afternoons were a little different. The emperor might be resting or plotting something dramatic, who knows. This gave some servants a tiny breathing space. Not free time, let's not get wild here, but a moment to refill water jars, tidy storerooms, or whisper quick conversations with someone they trusted. You see, in a world where you couldn't speak freely, little whispered talks in quiet corners felt like gold. People shared tiny jokes, traded small favors, or just said, "Hang in there," without actually using those words. Laundry slaves worked by big stone basins, scrubbing tunics, robes, and those endless sheets. Gardeners clipped hedges into fancy shapes that only emperors cared about. Some servants cleaned statues. Yes, statues, because if even one nose had a bit of dust, someone would hear about it. Animal keepers fed birds, dogs, and sometimes stranger pets. If Caligula decided his favorite creature needed grapes, someone had to run and find grapes right away. Evening brought a different kind of rush. If there was a dinner or party, the entire palace transformed. Lamps were lit, dishes lined up, musicians prepared. Servants had to glide through the chaos like silent ghosts. Nobody wanted to trip in front of the emperor's guests. That was the kind of mistake that stuck in people's memories. For those not serving at parties, night meant cleaning up from the day, folding, scrubbing, sweeping. If something wasn't ready for the next morning, there'd be trouble before sunrise. And yes, people did sleep eventually, just not much. Slaves usually had simple sleeping quarters tucked away in corners of the palace, away from the grand halls. The spaces were small, quiet, and smelled like hard work. But after a long day, even a thin mat on a cold floor felt like heaven. Some people whispered quick prayers before bed. Others just collapsed without a word, because tomorrow the palace would awake again before the sun, and so would they. It's easy to look at ancient Rome and imagine servants strolling around like extras in a movie, but the truth was a lot messier. Serving in Caligula's palace wasn't about living in luxury. It was about surviving in a schedule built for someone else's comfort. If the emperor wanted food at midnight, someone had to bring it. If the emperor wanted flowers in winter, someone had to find them. If the emperor wanted silence, everyone had to disappear. What made the palace so strange was the mix of beauty and pressure. There were gold decorations, fancy fountains, and soft music, but also tired hands, aching backs, and quiet hearts. Every shiny thing you saw had someone working behind it to make it shine. The daily routine was strict, yes, but over time, people learned to live inside it. Some even found little ways to make it bearable. A joke shared in the kitchen, a few extra seconds of warmth near the ovens, a quiet song hummed while folding sheets. It wasn't much, but sometimes tiny comforts can carry a person through big storms. By the time the palace lights dimmed, the day had already planned itself out again. Tomorrow would be the same rhythm, the same footsteps, the same rules. Nothing in the palace really belonged to the servants. Not their time, not their names, not even their voices. But they moved through it anyway, because they had to. So the next time someone says life in the emperor's palace must have been glamorous, you can just smile a little, because behind every shiny plate was a tired hand. Behind every soft rug was someone scrubbing floors at dawn. That was the real daily life of Caligula's palace. Organized chaos wrapped in gold. If the palace was a giant machine, then the kitchen was its fiery, noisy, always buzzing engine. And if you worked there, well, you didn't need a clock. The kitchen had its own rhythm, fast, hot, and loud. Every single feast, banquet, or random snack Caligula craved started here. You could say that the emperor's mood often depended on the smell drifting out of this place. The kitchen itself wasn't a small, cozy room. Oh no, it was huge. Stone walls, big ovens, heavy bronze pots, roaring fires, and people everywhere. Imagine a train station at rush hour, except everyone's carrying bread, oil, or a fist that's probably too big for the plate. The kitchen slaves had no time to stand still. Some were chopping vegetables, others were stirring sauces in giant pots. Someone was running for more oil, because apparently Romans believed you could never have too much olive oil.
The air was always warm, thick with the smell of roasting meat, fresh bread, herbs, and sometimes mystery ingredients. Romans loved trying new things. They mixed flavors like artists mixing colors. The head cook was basically the general of this little army. And let me tell you, this person didn't mess around. One wrong move with a dish, and they'd give you a stare that could probably melt a bronze pan. Roman feasts were a big deal. not just for the emperor, but for guests, senators, rich people, and anyone important enough to sit at the long marble tables. When Caligula wanted to impress people, he didn't just give them food, he gave them a show. The food had to look beautiful, smell perfect, and arrive on time like it was trained by a drill sergeant. In the early hours, kitchen slaves prepared bread, lots of it. Flat loaves, round loaves, sweet loaves. Bread with seeds, bread with honey. Bread was basically the Wi-Fi of the Roman world. Everybody needed it. Then came meats and stews. If there was a feast that night, the real work started early. Giant ovens were lit, spits were turned, spices crushed. It looked more like an ancient action movie than a kitchen. And then there were the extras: fruit platters, cheese, sauces, roasted nuts. Roman elites loved variety. If they could eat 5 different things at once, they would. And the palace kitchen made sure they could. What made this even wilder was timing. Everything had to be ready at the exact right moment. Not too early, not too late. Just perfect. The emperor didn't like cold food, and nobody wanted him grumpy at the dinner table. The slaves who served at the actual feasts had their own training. They had to learn how to walk silently, hold trays steady, and keep their faces calm no matter what happened. If someone sneezed mid-service, keep walking. If someone dropped a fig, smile and step over it. It wasn't just serving food. It was a carefully choreographed dance. One mistake could make the wrong person notice you, and that was never good. Feasts themselves were something else. Long tables covered in fine cloth, fancy cups, plates that sparkled, people reclining on couches, talking loudly, laughing, and acting like life was one big celebration. And at the center of all that glitter was the kitchen's hard work. While guests laughed, servants moved behind the scenes like ghosts, refilling cups, replacing plates, wiping spills before anyone even noticed. The guests might have thought the feast just happened, but behind every bite was someone working their hands off. Sometimes feasts went on for hours, and if Caligula was in a especially good or dramatic mood, it could stretch even longer. Servants carried round after round of food, wine, and fruit. Kitchen slaves kept fires burning, sweating like they were running a marathon with no finish line. If a dish was late, you'd better run faster. If it was too early, you'd better hide it somewhere warm and hope nobody noticed. And here's something funny. The kitchen workers often smelled like the dishes they made. You could tell who worked near the bread ovens because they always smelled like warm loaves. The roasters smelled like smoke and spice. The sauce stirrers smelled like garlic, herbs, and sometimes mild regret. Despite all the chaos, the kitchen had its own kind of community. People shared little jokes while stirring pots. Someone might sneak a tiny bite, very carefully. Another might hum a song to make the work less heavy. It was hard work, but it was also where some of the strongest bonds were formed. Because when you're trying not to burn bread together, you become a team real fast. As the night wore on and the feast slowly died down, the real cleanup began. Mountains of dirty plates, spilled oil, crumbs everywhere, pots that weighed more than some of the kitchen workers. It was the least glamorous part of the job, but it had to be done. No matter how tired people were, the kitchen had to be spotless before the next sunrise, because tomorrow it would all start again. And then there was the emperor himself. If Caligula decided to show up in the kitchen or make some surprise demand, like a particular kind of dish, right now, everyone moved faster than they thought humanly possible. The kitchen didn't argue. It just cooked. Working there was a strange mix of stress and survival skills. You learned how to keep a fire steady. You learned how to carry hot pots without flinching. You learned how to stay quiet when your feet ached. In a way, the kitchen was its own little world inside the palace, hot, loud, and alive. The funny thing is, most of the guests at these fancy feasts never thought about the people behind the curtains. They saw shining plates and steaming food, but not the tired hands that made it happen. For the slaves who worked there, those feasts weren't parties. They were long, sweaty, never-ending shifts. Still, a few found small joys in the madness. The smell of warm bread, a quick grin from someone they trusted, the tiny victory of getting a dish out on time. In a palace where most things weren't in their control, those tiny wins mattered. By the time the last plate was washed and the fires were dimmed, the kitchen finally grew quiet. Just the sound of water dripping, and maybe a sigh or two from people lying on the floor for a second before heading to their cramped sleeping rooms. Tomorrow, the ovens would roar again, the knives would chop again, and the palace would eat again. Because if there was one thing Caligula's palace never ran out of, it was feasts. When the sun went down on Caligula's palace, most of Rome thought things got quiet. No, the palace didn't sleep. It shifted. The fancy guests left, the laughter faded, the lamps dimmed, but behind those big marble walls, a different kind of life started. It wasn't loud like daytime, but it was just as busy, just quieter, sneakier. The night shift. Night in the palace wasn't empty. Guards patrolled the halls, servants cleaned up what the day left behind, kitchen workers scrubbed pots, laundry crews folded clothes, and the night watch servants moved through the shadowy corridors, making sure everything was in its place. If the day felt like a storm, the night felt like walking on a frozen lake. Every sound mattered. The first rule of the night: move silently. No echoing footsteps, no clanging buckets, no dramatic sneezing fits. Even the people who worked here learned how to walk like cats, light steps, slow breaths, and always listening. If you messed up and made noise near the wrong door, a guard might pop out of the shadows like, "Hey, what's going on?" And trust me, nobody liked that. The second rule is keep your eyes open. Strange things happened at night. Not always dangerous, just sometimes weird. Doors opened when nobody was there. A lamp would go out on its own. Sometimes you'd hear whispers in a language you didn't understand. But most of the time, it wasn't anything magical, just servants working in corners or officials having private conversations they didn't want anyone to hear. And the night watch, they saw it all. But they didn't talk about it.
The palace at night looked different. By day, it was all gold, marble, and sunlight. But at night, shadows filled every corner. Lamps threw long, wiggly shapes on the walls. Statues that looked noble in the daytime now looked slightly creepy. The halls felt longer, the ceilings felt higher, and even the fountains seemed to whisper in the dark. For someone new, the night could feel a little spooky, but for the people who worked there long enough, the silence became normal, comforting even. One of the most important groups at night was the lamp crew. These were the servants responsible for keeping the palace lit just enough so nobody broke their toes on a column. They carried little oil flasks and long sticks with small flames, moving through the corridors like floating fireflies. If a lamp went out, they quietly relit it. No big speeches, just light, move, repeat. Then there were the cleaners. Oh yes, the palace didn't clean itself. While everyone else slept, they swept the grand halls, wiped down tables, and polished bronze bowls. It was the only time of day they could work without someone yelling orders over their shoulders. Some actually preferred the night shift. Sure, it was quiet, but it was their quiet. No officials barking at them, no guests dropping grapes on the floor. And between you and me, some might even hum soft songs to keep themselves company. The laundry workers were another late-night crew, washing robes, sheets, and endless towels. Their workspace was tucked away near the edge of the palace, where the water ran cooler and cleaner. You could always tell where they worked by the soft splash of water and the smell of soap. It wasn't glamorous, but at least they didn't have to dodge senators or look at Caligula's unpredictable moods. Of course, you couldn't talk about the night without mentioning the guards. Big, silent, serious. These guys walked in pairs, spears in hand, eyes sharp. Their job was to make sure no one went where they shouldn't, and that nothing strange happened overnight. Servants learned fast which hallways belonged to them. If you saw a guard coming, best to step aside and lower your eyes. Not because they were mean. Well, some were, but because night guards didn't like surprises. And then there were the whispers. Oh yes, the palace had plenty of those. Late at night, when most of the city was sleeping, deals were made in dark corners. Little secrets traded hands. A few powerful people liked meeting after dark. No curious ears around, just quiet hallways and flickering lamps. The Night Watch saw it all. They didn't dare repeat it. In a place like this, knowing too much could be dangerous. The safest thing to do was see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. Some servants liked the night shift for one simple reason: less pressure. No emperor yelling, no guests making demands, just work, steady, and predictable. A few even joked that the palace was nicer at night, like a grumpy person who finally calmed down after yelling all day. Of course, it wasn't all peaceful. Sometimes a tray would fall, or a lamp would tip, or someone would accidentally walk into the wrong hallway and freeze like a rabbit in front of a lion. But these were little things. Everyone learned how to handle them fast. And then there were moments of quiet beauty, too. Like when the moonlight came through the garden windows, or when the fountains shimmered in silver light, or when everything was so still you could hear your own heartbeat. The Night Watch also had their little survival tricks, like never walk alone through the main hall after midnight. It echoed too much. Don't stare at statues too long. Your imagination will do weird things. And most important, if you see a door slightly open, just keep walking. It's not your problem. Everyone who lasted long enough on the night shift had a story. The time I almost bumped into an official. The time a lamp went out by itself. The time I thought I saw a ghost, but it was just a gardener half asleep. Toward the end of the night, just before dawn, things got quiet. Like really quiet. The last of the cleaning finished. The laundry was hung to dry. Guards slowed their pace. This was the secret soft hour of the palace, the time when even the shadows seemed to sigh and stretch. Servants who worked the night shift often said this was their favorite moment. Not because they were free, they weren't, but because for a brief heartbeat, the palace stopped spinning. Then came the morning bell, the sound that told everyone the day was about to start again. New workers took over. Daylight crept through the windows. The Night Watch quietly slipped away to their small sleeping quarters, exhausted but alive. They'd seen everything, heard everything, and said nothing. Being part of the Night Watch was like living in a different world inside the same palace. By day, everything was loud, fast, and full of orders. By night, it was shadows, whispers, and silent footsteps.
Most people outside never saw that side of Caligula's palace. But for the servants who walked those quiet halls, it was a world they knew by heart. Let's be real. When you pack a palace full of servants, guards, cooks, dancers, and powerful people with big egos, gossip is going to happen. In Caligula's palace, gossip wasn't just background noise, it was its own system. Like a spider web, quiet, sticky, and connected to everything. Some folks think gossip is just about who's dating who or who wore the ugliest sandals at dinner. But here, whispers were like currency. They could lift you up or make your life miserable. One small word, one wrong whisper, and boom, you could find yourself scrubbing the floor of the coldest hallway for months. But on the flip side, the right whisper at the right time could also save your neck. Yeah, it was that serious. The palace had no official rulebook for gossip, but everyone who worked there learned fast. There were unwritten laws, little codes. If you wanted to survive as a servant in that chaotic palace, you needed to know how to move through this whisper world. Rule number 1, listen more than you talk. Servants who talked too much got noticed, and being noticed wasn't always good. But the ones who listened, they learned things. Who was in a bad mood? Who might yell today? Who to stay far away from? Some even joked, your ears keep you alive more than your feet. Rule number 2, never say a name you don't have to. Whispers were safe when they were vague. Someone said this. I heard that. The less direct you were, the less likely it would bounce back and bite you later. If your name came up in a bad story, well, that was trouble. So people learned to keep stories floating like smoke. Hard to grab, hard to blame. Now let's talk about how gossip moved. It wasn't like today's phones or DMs, obviously. It traveled through hallways, shared while scrubbing floors, whispered in the laundry rooms, or slipped between two people carrying water jugs down the garden paths. One quiet conversation here, another there, and before sunrise, a story could travel from the kitchen all the way to the guards at the emperor's door. Every palace had its web keepers. Not an official title, but everyone knew who they were. These were the servants who seemed to know everything before anyone else. They didn't shout or brag. They just listened. One of them might say, "Be careful around the east wing today." No explanation, just a look. And if you were smart, you listened. Because usually, they were right.
There was a big difference between harmless gossip and dangerous gossip. Harmless gossip was about things like who tripped on the steps during lunch, which dancer sang off key last night, who ate too many figs from the kitchen. These whispers made people laugh. They made long work days a little easier. It was like passing around a little entertainment to survive the chaos. Dangerous gossip was another story. That was the kind that involved powerful people too high up the ladder. A whisper about them could turn into a storm real quick. And in Caligula's palace, everyone knew. The closer a whisper came to the emperor's ears, the hotter it burned. Servants who weren't careful sometimes got caught in storms they never meant to create. All it took was someone saying, I heard you said something. And even if you didn't, good luck proving it. So most people learned to keep their mouths zipped. One sneaky trick was using code words. Instead of saying someone's name, they'd say something like, the tall statue's in a bad mood today, or better not walk past the red door. Everyone who worked there knew what it really meant. Outsiders would be lost, but insiders got it right away. This way, gossip could travel without pointing fingers. Smart, right? Here's the funny part. Even the powerful people, The rich folks and the guards, they gossiped too. Oh yes, no one was above the whisper game. While servants traded whispers over chores, some senators whispered behind fans. Guards swapped quiet rumors between patrols. Dancers shared secrets in dressing rooms. It was like the whole palace ran on secrets, like a machine powered by whispers. Of course, there were also twisters. These were the people who didn't just pass gossip along, they changed it a little. Added a word, bent the truth. Suddenly, a small story grew bigger and louder. Someone saying, "I think the emperor sneezed," could turn into, "The emperor is furious," by the time it reached the fifth person. Everyone knew about these twisters. They were dangerous and weirdly a little impressive. You could never be sure where the truth ended and the drama started. For some servants, gossip was survival. Imagine you're new to the palace. You don't know who's friendly, who's strict, or who to avoid at all costs. But if someone quietly says, "Don't go near the garden door after sunset," you've just been handed a free ticket to staying out of trouble. That's the thing. Whispers didn't just entertain people. They warned them, protected them, gave them a map in a palace full of traps. Of course, if you used gossip wrong, it could backfire badly. Some tried to use it to climb the ladder, passing secrets to the wrong person, trying to make themselves look important. That rarely ended well. In places like this, being too loud could make you a target. The smart ones stayed quiet, watched, listened, survived. There were nights when the gossip web felt like a living thing. It stretched through halls, kitchens, baths, gardens, like invisible threads. And when something big happened in the palace, you could feel it in the air. People's voices dropped lower. Their eyes got wider. It was like everyone knew something, but no one dared to say it out loud. The strongest rule of all? Never let a whisper reach the wrong ears. Because if it did, it wasn't just gossip anymore. It became a spark in a place full of oil lamps. And sparks in Caligula's palace could set a lot of trouble on fire. So while the city outside Rome slept, inside the palace, the gossip web stayed alive. Servants leaned in close. Guards traded careful looks. Secrets moved like quiet rivers through the stone corridors. Gossip wasn't just a game, it was survival. And for the people trapped in this golden cage, sometimes a whisper could save you. Other times, it could break you. When most people imagine a Roman emperor's palace, they picture gold plates, mountains of food, and feasts that last all night. And yeah, they're not wrong. Caligula loved his feasts. Big, loud, shiny, and a little too much. But what people don't see in those fancy pictures? The army of servants working behind the curtain, running around like their sandals are on fire. If daytime in the palace felt wild, feast nights were pure chaos. Let's start with the food itself. These feasts weren't about eating a simple meal. No way. This was about showing off. The emperor didn't just want bread and soup. He wanted dishes that screamed, "Look at how rich I am." Cooks roasted birds stuffed with other birds. They baked bread so soft you could squish it with one finger. They decorated fruit like it was a painting. Even the water jugs were carved and polished. And let's not forget the meat. So much meat! The kitchen during a feast looked like a battlefield, but with chickens. Big clay ovens glowed hot, smoke floated in the air, and cooks shouted over each other to grab spices, stir pots, and make sure nothing burned. If a dish came out wrong, oh boy, you better hope your name didn't get called. One poor kitchen boy once dropped a tray of honey cakes before they reached the table. People said the silence that followed was louder than a thunderstorm. Don't worry, someone quickly replaced them. There were always backups.
The servants in charge of carrying the food were like the palace's delivery ninjas. They balanced trays full of heavy dishes, walked fast but smooth, and made sure nothing wobbled. One wrong step on the marble floor and, well, let's just say it wouldn't be pretty. These workers practiced walking straight like soldiers, heads down, eyes focused. No talking, no laughing, just tray, step, and the smells? Oh, man. Roasted meat, fresh bread, spiced wine, warm honey. Imagine working all night surrounded by the best smells ever and not being allowed to eat a single bite. Then there were the table arrangers. Their job was to make the feast look perfect before anyone touched a fork. Plates had to shine, cups had to sparkle, grapes had to hang just right on the platter. If even one dish was crooked, someone would notice, and not in a good way. They even sprinkled flower petals on the table sometimes. Why? Because luxury. It was Rome's way of saying, yeah, this meal cost more than your house. When the guests entered the feast hall, the mood flipped like a coin. Music, chatter, and clinking cups filled the room. Powerful people sat on couches, leaning back like they owned the world. Servants stood at the walls, silent, waiting for the next snap of a finger. That was the rule. Servants didn't speak unless spoken to. They moved like shadows, in, out, no noise. A perfect feast to the guests meant hours of hard work for the people behind it. The wine pourers had their own tricky job. Roman nobles liked their wine mixed with water. Not too weak, not too strong. Pour too little, they complained. Pour too much, they complained louder. And if a cup ran empty before the guest was ready for it, let's just say you didn't want to be that servant. Wine was everywhere during these feasts. The guests laughed louder, their faces got redder, and the air got heavier. Meanwhile, the servants just kept pouring. But here's the thing nobody talked about in the official stories. Feasts were messy, like really messy. Guests would throw bones under the table. They'd spill wine on the floor. Sometimes they'd get bored and play with their food like kids. The fancy feast tables looked amazing at the start of the night and like a disaster zone by the end. That's when the cleanup crew came in like quiet heroes. They didn't wear capes, but trust me, they deserved them.
When the last guest stumbled out of the hall, the real work started. Broken cups, sticky floors, and piles of dirty dishes waited. The servants swept up bones, wiped up spilled wine, and gathered plates taller than their heads. The kitchen would be a mountain of mess by then. Pots blackened by the fire, trays stacked high, breadcrumbs everywhere. Some people think working at a feast was glamorous. Yeah, no. It was hot, loud, and exhausting. Here's a fun fact. Well, maybe not fun for the workers. When Caligula wanted to impress someone, he didn't just serve a lot of food. He served rare food. Stuff shipped from faraway places. Fish from distant seas. Fruits that took days to travel. That meant extra pressure. If something arrived late or spoiled, guess who got blamed? Hint, not the emperor. Of course, there were tiny moments of light for the servants too. A quick laugh in the kitchen, a wink between tray carriers, a secret crumb of bread swallowed behind the curtain. These little moments helped them survive the madness. Some of the older servants even turned feast nights into games, like guessing which senator would spill his drink first, or betting how many minutes before someone fell asleep mid-toast. Small joys in a world full of noise. But the truth is, feasts were also dangerous places for gossip. One wrong whisper too close to the wrong table, you might end up in deep trouble. So the smart ones stayed silent, eyes down, ears open. They were invisible, but they saw everything. Toward the end of the night, after the last guest left and the lights dimmed, the hall looked like a battlefield after a war of bread and grapes.
Servants scrubbed floors, picked up crushed petals, and stacked dishes. The air smelled like cold wine and burned candles. Their arms ached, their feet hurt, but they worked fast because the palace didn't wait for anyone. By dawn, the hall would be spotless again. Shiny floors, clean tables, like nothing happened. The guests would wake up the next day remembering how grand the feast was. But the servants, they'd remember the piles of dishes, the long night, and how they barely had time to breathe. That's the thing about Caligula's palace. The glory you saw on the outside was built on quiet, sweaty work in the shadows. The golden plates looked royal, but behind them was a kitchen full of tired hands making it all happen. So next time someone paints a picture of a perfect Roman feast, just know there was a tired worker somewhere holding a heavy tray whispering to themselves, "Don't drop it, don't drop it." Working in Caligula's palace wasn't like working in a normal house. Nope. It was like working in a place where the weather changed without warning. 1 second sunny, next second thunderstorm. And the weather wasn't the sky. It was the emperor. Caligula's moods were famous. People said he could go from a soft laugh to an icy glare faster than a candle flame flickers. If you worked in the palace, this meant one thing. You had to learn how to read the air. The first rule, watch his face. Before anyone said a word, servants studied every little twitch. If his smile looked real, good. If it looked forced, well, that was not good. A raised eyebrow? That meant be careful. A sharp stare meant do not mess up. And if he was silent for too long, oh boy, people walked on eggshells. Servants used to joke quietly. His eyebrows speak louder than his mouth. But it wasn't really a joke. Reading those tiny signs could be the difference between a calm day and total panic. The second rule, move smooth, talk less. No sudden movements, no loud noises, no dropping spoons on the marble floor, unless you liked giving everyone a heart attack. You didn't just walk past the emperor. You glided like a shadow. You spoke like a breeze. Some servants trained for weeks just to learn how to place a cup without making a sound. The emperor liked control, and he liked people to know he had it. He didn't have to shout. Just a wave of his hand could change the mood in the whole hall. If he was happy, music played louder, laughter flowed, everyone breathed easier. But if his temper shifted, you could feel the air get heavier, like a storm cloud rolling in. Even the palace guards felt it. These weren't soft-hearted men. They were trained to keep straight faces. But even they stood a little taller and stiffer when his mood went dark. You could almost hear the sound of 100 heartbeats holding their breath. And light to that wan, sunly part of the sky. Caligula also loved surprises, and not the fun kind. He might be cheerful one moment, joking with guests, and then suddenly toss out a command that made everyone freeze. It wasn't about the command itself. It was the not knowing what would happen next that made life in the palace so stressful. For the servants, it was like tiptoeing across a frozen pond and waiting for a crack. Some of the older workers had mastered the art of survival. They knew, never lock eyes with him too long. Never speak first. Always agree fast. They called it the yes wind, because if the emperor asked a question, your head should be nodding before your brain even finished processing it. Even the way they placed food on his table followed a secret rhythm. First the tray, then the cup. Step back exactly 3 steps. Bow just enough, not too low, not too short. The tiniest wrong move could make the room tense. And when the room tensed, everyone knew, stay very, very still. You might think only the high-ranking officials felt this pressure. Nope. Even the guy refilling the lamps felt it. Even the girl carrying towels. The emperor's temper didn't care what your job title was. If you were in the room, you had to play the game. And here's the thing.
The emperor didn't even have to do something big. Sometimes all it took was a sharp look, or a long pause in the middle of a laugh. Suddenly, the entire room went quiet. Dancers froze mid-step. Musicians pretended their instruments suddenly needed tuning. Servants tried to blend into the walls like furniture. People in the palace learned to share silent warnings with each other. A raised eyebrow between servants, a soft throat clear, a tiny hand motion. That was their own secret language, like little flashing red lights saying, "Uh-oh, mood shift." The funny thing is, Caligula also had good moods, and when he was in those, everything sparkled. Feasts got louder, orders became jokes, people dared to smile. But the thing that made it tricky was no one ever knew how long it would last. It could be 10 minutes, it could be 2 hours, then bam, back to walking on thin marble. Some of the older servants compared it to living near a volcano. When it's quiet, it's beautiful, warm, peaceful. But deep down, everyone knows it can erupt without warning. So you keep your shoes ready to run. Of course, servants couldn't actually run, so they did the next best thing, stayed quiet and invisible. There was also this unspoken rule. If something went wrong in front of the emperor, don't point fingers, don't explain, don't argue. Just fix it fast and pray the mood doesn't land on you. That's why the palace looked so smooth on the outside. Every tray polished, every step timed. Because behind that perfect picture was a crowd of nervous people making sure nothing cracked in front of the volcano.
One of the most dangerous places to work was the front hall, the room where the emperor often sat during the day. New workers dreaded their first shift there. The veterans would pat them on the shoulder and whisper, "Good luck, don't blink too loud." The marble floor in that hall was so shiny that even your own reflection looked scared. Sometimes, people outside the palace thought serving the emperor must have been an honor, a golden job, a dream. But inside, it was a daily balancing act. Even a single cough at the wrong moment could make hearts race. Yet, somehow, people survived it. They learned his patterns. They read the air like weather maps. Some even got good at predicting his mood before he walked in. And if they made it through a day without any mood explosions, that counted as a good day. That's the strange thing about life in Caligula's palace. Everything looked strong, marble walls, golden statues, glittering feasts. But underneath it all, everyone was just trying to stay out of the storm. Every servant walked those halls knowing that the floor wasn't the only thing made of marble. The emperor's temper was too. Hard, cold, and one wrong step could crack it wide open. If you thought Caligula's palace was dramatic, wait till you hear about his entertainments. This man didn't believe in quiet board games or a nice cup of tea. Nope. When he wanted fun, he wanted the entire city to feel it. Whenever the emperor got bored, which honestly happened a lot, he would suddenly decide, let's have games. And when Caligula said games, everyone started moving like ants whose nest just got kicked. Servants ran, guards shouted, musicians tuned their instruments, and workers decorated the arena like their lives depended on it. Because, well, sometimes it did. The first sign of a game day was the trumpets, loud, echoing through the streets. It was the Roman version of, "Hey everyone, something crazy's about to happen." Crowds gathered, people pushed, children climbed on walls just to get a look. Nobody wanted to miss the emperor's big show. Inside the arena, it wasn't like your average playground. It was massive, packed with seats, banners, guards, and of course, Caligula's golden box seat at the very top. His seat wasn't just a chair, it was a statement. Gold, silk, and a view of everything. He didn't just want to watch the show, he wanted to control it. The games could mean many things. Sometimes they were races, fast, wild races with chariots zooming around the track like mad horses had no brakes. People loved these. They screamed and waved flags. The emperor cheered too, But let's be honest, everyone else cheered because they had to. If he picked a team to support, you picked that team too. Simple rule. If Caligula said blue wins, then guess what? Blue was everyone's favorite color that day. Other times, the games were more intense. Animal shows, sword fights, strange performances that were half terrifying, half entertaining. The emperor liked the thrill. The bigger the chaos, the wider his smile. For the people in the stands, it was fun. For the servants working behind the scenes, it was like trying to juggle flaming torches while standing on a rolling barrel. Behind the arena, it was a whole different world. Workers dragged props, stable boys calmed down nervous horses, and handlers tried to keep wild animals from eating each other before the show even started. There were people who did nothing but shine Caligula's special seat. Others practiced how to bow fast when he arrived. Every job mattered, because any mistake could ruin the emperor's mood. And when his mood broke, well, we already know what that meant. Caligula liked to make dramatic entrances. He'd walk in dressed like he owned the world, which technically he kind of did. His cloak would flow behind him like a fancy red wave. The crowd would roar. Trumpets blared again. It was less a normal event and more like the opening scene of a very expensive play. People didn't clap because they loved him. They clapped because silence would have been a bad idea. Once he sat down, the real show began. The races, the shouting, the sound of hooves thundering across the dirt, the smell of food, sweat, dust, and excitement mixing in the air. For a moment, even the servants forgot their fear. It was hard not to get caught up in the energy of thousands of people screaming at the same time. But here's the twist. The emperor didn't just watch. He liked to change things. In the middle of a race, he might suddenly wave his hand and shout, "Again!" or "Faster!" or sometimes just laugh and toss his drink, because why not? If something annoyed him, maybe a horse tripped, maybe a charioteer looked at him weird, he could stop the whole game. Just like that. There was one unspoken rule in those games. Follow the emperor's mood. If he laughed, everyone laughed louder. If he frowned, the music stopped. If he looked bored, entertainers panicked. Even the gladiators, those strong and fearless fighters, kept one eye on the arena and one eye on the emperor's box. Sometimes, Caligula would give out prizes to the racers or performers who impressed him. Gold coins, shiny objects, maybe even a house. And when that happened, the crowd went wild. It was like Oprah giving out chariots. But sometimes, he'd just decide, nah, no prize, just because he felt like it. The line between glory and disaster was as thin as a chariot wheel. The servants who worked closest to him during the games had the toughest job. They had to keep his seat shaded just right, refill his cup without spilling, and react fast if he gave even the tiniest signal. Some said the best servants were basically mind readers. If his foot tapped, that meant he was bored. If his fingers drummed the armrest, something was about to change. If he leaned forward slowly, everyone behind him panicked quietly. You might think, well, at least the games were fun for the people. Yes, for the crowd, it was a holiday, free entertainment, a break from their daily grind. But for the workers, it was a day full of running, sweating, and making sure not a single thing went wrong. It was like hosting the biggest birthday party in the world, except the birthday boy had a temper that could flip like a coin. And still, the people loved it. The emperor's games were the talk of the town for weeks. Who won, who lost, who got rewarded, who got in trouble. It didn't matter how unpredictable it was, the crowd came back every single time. When the sun went down, the arena was a mess. Dust everywhere, broken wheels, empty cups, tired horses, and servants dragging their feet back to the palace, whispering to each other, "We survived another one." That was the victory no one talked about. The real prize was making it through the day without the emperor snapping. And Caligula, he'd walk away like a king who just conquered the world, probably already planning the next surprise event in his head. So yeah, the games were legendary. People cheered, horses ran, trumpets sang. But beneath all that shine, there was a quiet army of people making sure every second went exactly how the emperor wanted. Because in Rome, the show didn't run on magic. It ran on fear and really, really fast chariots. If there was one thing that spread faster than a Roman fire, it was palace gossip. You didn't need a newspaper, you didn't need a message board. All you needed was a broom, a bucket, or a tray of food, and 2 ears. Because inside Caligula's palace, whispers could travel faster than chariot wheels on race day. You see, the palace looked quiet from the outside. White marble walls, fancy gardens, guards standing still like statues. It looked like a place where serious stuff happened. But inside, oh boy, behind those grand doors, gossip lived like it paid rent. Servants had their own kind of network. No scrolls, no meetings, just whispers in hallways, quiet talk in kitchens, and tiny signals passed during long nights of work. One cook might whisper to a cleaner, "Guess who Caligula yelled at this morning?" The cleaner would whisper to a guard, "Guess who's not eating dinner tonight?" And by sunset, the whole palace would know what happened. The reason gossip worked so well was simple. People needed it to survive. If you didn't know what the emperor's mood was like, you could walk right into trouble. A simple whisper could save your job or even your life. Today he's laughing. Today he's quiet. Today, don't even look at him. Those little bits of information were pure gold. The kitchen was basically gossip HQ. The cooks heard everything. Why? Because food went everywhere, to the guards, to the guests, to the emperor's table. If someone was upset, they'd grumble to the cook. If someone got promoted, they'd brag to the cook. The kitchen wasn't just a place for bread and cheese. It was a place where stories got toasted and served hot. Next, there was the laundry room. People don't think about laundry when they imagine Roman palaces, but oh, it was important. Servants washed robes, cloaks, and tunics every day. And clothes told stories. A torn robe meant someone got in trouble. A new set of silk meant someone gained favor. Laundry workers would exchange information faster than they could fold a sheet. And trust me, they were fast. Then there were the hallway sweepers. These folks had the best ears. They didn't talk much, but they listened like professionals. Their brooms made soft noises, so no one really paid attention to them. But that was their secret weapon. While nobles argued or servants whispered, the sweepers caught every word like little gossip sponges. But here's the funny part. Nobody admitted they gossiped. "Oh no, I don't talk," said the cleaner who just told 5 people about the emperor's new sandals. "I keep to myself," said the guard who just passed a juicy secret to a kitchen boy. Gossip was like smoke in the palace. Nobody saw where it started, but it got everywhere. Of course, gossip wasn't just about drama. It was a kind of protection. If someone whispered that Caligula was in a bad mood, everyone suddenly worked a little faster. Floors were polished shinier. Plates were carried more carefully. Everyone stood up straighter. No one wanted to be the unlucky one caught when the emperor felt stormy. The palace even had its unofficial gossip stars. There was usually one servant who knew everything first. Maybe it was a guard near the emperor's chamber. Maybe a kitchen boy with fast feet. Maybe the woman who poured Caligula's wine. People didn't fear the emperor's messengers. They feared these first whisperers. They had the power to shape how everyone else moved through the day. Sometimes the gossip wasn't even true. Someone would say, "I heard Caligula's leaving the palace." Then someone else would say, "No, he's bringing guests." And then by afternoon, the whole palace was preparing a feast for no reason. When the emperor didn't show up, everyone just went, "Huh," and went back to work. Lesson learned, even fake gossip had power.
And here's where it gets a bit funny. Caligula himself probably knew about this whisper network. Maybe he even liked it. He loved being unpredictable. And when people gossiped nervously, it reminded him that everyone was watching him all the time. Sometimes he'd suddenly change his plans just to keep people guessing. One minute he'd say no party, and the next he'd walk in with a dozen guests. Boom! Chaos! You can imagine the kitchen in those moments. Bread burning, wine spilling, someone yelling, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" And somewhere in the corner, the first whisperer would shrug like, "Hey, I just repeat what I hear." But gossip wasn't all about the emperor. Servants gossiped about each other too. Who got a better room? Who got new sandals? Who dropped a tray and got away with it? A palace is like a tiny city. Everyone has their little victories and disasters, and everyone loves a good story, especially when it's not about them. There were also secret codes. You couldn't always talk openly, especially if guards were nearby. So servants made tiny signals. A tug on the sleeve meant bad day. A quick look toward the emperor's chamber meant he's awake. A tap of the foot meant don't go there right now. It was like their own little spy language. And the night shift? Oh, that's when gossip got real dramatic. Everything was quieter. The corridors echoed more. People whispered softer, but the stories were juicier. Who came in late? Who left early? What the emperor said to his advisor. Night gossip felt more secret, more important, even if it was just about someone tripping on the stairs. But remember, gossip could be dangerous too. If the wrong whisper reached the wrong ear, someone could be punished. That's why most gossip was shared carefully. Quiet voices, trusted friends, corners with no guards. The palace walls had ears, people used to say. And in Caligula's palace, that was not just a figure of speech. Still, even with the danger, gossip was the glue that held everyone together. It made the work less lonely. It gave people tiny bits of power in a world where they didn't have much control. It made them feel like they knew something, even if they couldn't change anything. So while nobles sat on marble chairs and the emperor plotted his next spectacle, down in the kitchens, hallways, and laundry rooms, the real news was passing from ear to ear, softly, like smoke through the cracks. The emperor had his gold and power. But the servants? They had their whispers. And in a place where speaking too loudly could be dangerous, those whispers were their secret shield.
A cleaner sweeping the west hallway froze mid-broom. She leaned her ear to the cold stone wall and heard it too. Fast, tense steps. She quietly set her broom down and did the most Roman thing she could, pretended she wasn't there. Meanwhile, the whispers began. What's happening? Did something go wrong? Is he awake? No one dared to say the emperor's name. Not tonight. Not with the air this thick. Even the guards, usually loud and bossy, spoke in clipped, careful voices. Their helmets gleamed under the torchlight as they exchanged short glances. Something was moving behind the scenes, and fast. In the palace, whispers spread like water down a hill. One servant whispered to another. The cooks whispered in the kitchen. A guard whispered to a scribe. Within minutes, everyone knew something was up, but no one knew what. Even the night birds outside seemed quieter. The emperor's private wing was suddenly full of activity. Men in armor moved quickly, but their faces were tense. They weren't protecting a party. They weren't welcoming guests. This was something else entirely, something dangerous. In a small servant room near the back, 4 workers huddled close together, pretending to polish silver cups. Their hands were shaking just a bit. "Do you think it's about the games?" one whispered. "No," said another. "This feels bigger." A third leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. "What if it's about him?" No one said his name, but everyone knew who him meant. Then came the sound.
Clang! A door slammed somewhere deep in the palace. Not the gentle, oops, breeze closed it kind of slam. This was loud, sharp, the kind of sound that made your stomach drop a little. The cleaners and cooks looked at each other. The torch flames shook again. Up in his golden room, Caligula was unaware, or maybe pretending not to care. He loved control. He loved surprises when he made them. But this was a surprise he didn't plan. And that made it dangerous. The inner guards, the ones closest to the emperor, began pulling tighter circles around his chamber. Their armor clinked softly. You could feel the tension in every step. They whispered orders that no servant could fully hear. But one thing was clear. Something big was happening tonight. Down in the hallway, a wine server, a small, nervous man with shaky hands, dropped his tray when a group of men stormed past him. The sound of the silver cup hitting the floor echoed through the hall like a bell. Everyone froze. One guard shot him a look so sharp it could have cut stone. The server gulped and stared at the floor. The night kept building like a drumbeat. More footsteps, more whispers, doors opening and closing. The usual calm of the palace was gone. And then the shouting started. Not loud at first, just sharp bursts of voices, orders, confusion, a mix of fear and power clashing in the dark. The gossip network, that invisible web of whispers, went into overdrive. Someone's inside. No, they're outside the door. Wait, someone saw a sword. It was like playing a dangerous game of telephone, except the prize was survival. One older servant, who had worked in the palace for years, whispered to the younger ones, "Stay away from the halls. Keep your head down. Nights like this, you don't want to be seen." Everyone listened. No one argued with someone who had survived more than one imperial panic. Suddenly, the torches in the main hall dimmed as a gust of wind swept through. The long curtains swayed like ghosts. In that moment, even the bravest guards felt a chill. Then came a single scream, short, sharp, and then silence. The palace froze. Even time seemed to pause. A pot rolling on the kitchen floor sounded louder than thunder. Someone whispered, "It's happening." The group moving through the palace wasn't just anyone. This was a plot, quiet, fast, and dangerous. Some people inside the palace wanted Caligula gone, and this night was their night. But for the servants, it wasn't about politics. They didn't care who sat on the throne. They just wanted to survive. They huddled in corners. They held their breath. They kept their eyes on the ground, hoping the storm would pass over them. As the noise grew closer to the emperor's chamber, everyone braced for the worst. A cupbearer whispered a quick prayer under his breath. A maid grabbed her friend's hand. A guard shifted uneasily, pretending not to be scared. The emperor's palace, usually so shiny, so full of forced laughter, now felt like a giant, dark cave. And just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy, buzzing kind that presses on your chest. Somewhere behind those golden doors, the future of the palace changed forever. No one rushed to find out what happened. Not the kitchen boy, not the guards, not the whisperers. Because in Caligula's palace, knowing too much was sometimes more dangerous than knowing nothing at all. Hours later, as the first light of dawn touched the marble floors, servants slowly stepped out from their hiding spots. The air smelled different, lighter, quieter. Something had ended. Something else had begun. People whispered softly, "It's over." No one said more than that. The palace had shaken in the night, and not everyone would walk away the same.
When the sun finally rose over Rome that morning, it didn't look any different. The rooftops still glowed gold, the city still hummed, and birds still flew over the Tiber River like nothing special had happened. But inside the palace, everything felt different, like the air itself was holding a quiet sigh. The night before had changed everything. No more shouting, no more rushed footsteps, no more flickering torches that made your stomach twist with fear. Caligula, the man who had made the palace shake with his moods and his power, was gone, and the palace woke up to something it hadn't felt in a long time. Silence. Servants peeked out of corners slowly, like rabbits checking for hawks. No one rushed, no one shouted orders. Even the guards, who usually barked at people like grumpy dogs, stood strangely still. It was the kind of quiet that made everyone whisper without realizing it. The first person to move was the old doorman. He had opened those gates every morning for years, but today his hands trembled a little. The hinges creaked softly. He looked around as if Caligula's voice would shout at him from nowhere. But there was no voice, just birds. One by one, the workers returned to their posts, not because anyone told them to, but because no one knew what else to do. A kitchen girl started boiling water. A guard leaned on his spear. A cleaner began sweeping the hall, even though there wasn't much dirt. Routine was safer than questions. The whispers started immediately. Is it true? Who's in charge now? Do we go home? Do we stay? No one really had answers. For so long, everything in that palace revolved around one man. And now, nothing did. The golden chamber, Caligula's special room, was locked. Guards stood around it, looking uneasy. Normally, being close to that door meant you were in danger. Today, it just felt empty.
In the kitchen, a cook leaned on a table and said, "I think I forgot what it's like to breathe normally." Another cook laughed softly, the kind of laugh you give when you don't know if it's safe to laugh. For the first time in years, the kitchen didn't feel like a war zone. No more racing to serve the emperor's wild demands. No more panic over a crooked plate. It was almost peaceful. But not everyone felt calm. Some servants whispered that things could get worse. Who will come next? What if he's worse than Caligula? What if we just traded one storm for another? Because in Rome, power didn't disappear. It just changed hands. Some guards were already moving with purpose. Not the wild chaos of the night before. This was a colder kind of movement. Quiet meetings, sharp looks. A new leader was being chosen somewhere behind those golden doors. And while they chose, the rest of the palace waited. For the slaves and servants, it didn't really matter who wore the crown. Life would probably look the same, cleaning, cooking, bowing, and surviving. But deep down, there was something different in their steps that morning. A tiny spark, a quiet relief. For the first time in years, the kitchen didn't feel like a war zone. No more racing to serve the emperor's wild demands. No more panic over a crooked plate. It was almost peaceful. But not everyone felt calm. Some servants whispered that things could get worse. Who will come next? What if he's worse than Caligula? What if we just traded one storm for another? Because in Rome, power didn't disappear. It just changed hands. Some guards were already moving with purpose. Not the wild chaos of the night before. This was a colder kind of movement. Quiet meetings, sharp looks. A new leader was being chosen somewhere behind those golden doors. And while they chose, the rest of the palace waited. For the slaves and servants, it didn't really matter who wore the crown. Life would probably look the same, cleaning, cooking, bowing, and surviving.
But deep down, there was something different in their steps that morning. A tiny spark, a quiet relief. For once, they could breathe without fear of Caligula's temper crashing down like thunder. In the hallway, the laundry workers whispered, "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" someone asked. "Nothing. That's the point." No shouting, no orders, just the sound of their own voices echoing off the stone walls. By midday, new orders began to trickle down like water dripping from a leaky roof. The guards tightened their patrols. Important men and women entered the palace, talking fast but quietly. Servants watched them the way cats watch dogs, carefully, ready to run if needed. But no matter what deals were being made upstairs, the palace itself felt lighter. The marble didn't seem so cold. The torches burned steady. The garden smelled fresher. Even the pigeons outside seemed a little bolder. For years, Caligula's palace had been a stage for fear. People learned to move quietly, to never speak too much, to always be ready for the next storm. But now, as sunlight filled the empty corridors, some servants dared to smile. Not big, loud smiles, just small, soft ones, the kind that say, "We made it through the night." A group of young servants sat behind the kitchen, sharing a loaf of bread they borrowed. They didn't even hide it this time. One of them laughed and said, "If he were still here, we'd be dead for this." Another shrugged. "He's not." It wasn't freedom, not really, but it was something close. Of course, everyone knew a new emperor was coming. Someone else would sit on that golden chair. Someone else would make the rules. But for this one morning, before the speeches and the new orders, the palace belonged to the silence. The old doorman, the same one who had opened the gates, sat on a bench and whispered, "The walls feel lighter." No one disagreed. Even the walls seemed to be resting. In the days that followed, soldiers marched in and officials took control. But the first sunrise after Caligula's fall stayed in everyone's memory. Not because of grand speeches or celebrations, but because for the first time in a long time, nothing happened. No fear, no sudden orders, no rush. And in a palace built on fear, nothing happening was a rare kind of gift. The palace would go on, new faces, new rules, new whispers. But the people who lived through that night, the kitchen boy, the doorman, the sweepers, the guards, they'd always remember the morning after. Not the danger, not the chaos, but the quiet. The air that finally felt light. Long after Caligula was gone, his palace still stood. The walls didn't crumble. The gardens still bloomed. The marble floors stayed polished. From the outside, nothing much changed. But if walls could talk, they'd whisper about everything they'd seen. Every corner of that palace carried memories like fingerprints pressed into soft clay. Footsteps had worn paths into the floors. Torches had burned black marks into the ceilings. Laughter had echoed in these halls, but so had fear. The whispers of those who had served, those who had suffered, and those who had survived still floated in the air like dust in sunlight. Years passed. Emperors came and went, like actors stepping on and off a stage. Each one brought their own rules, their own pride, their own drama. But no one could completely wash away what had happened in Caligula's time. It stuck to the palace like a shadow. New servants walked those halls. Many of them didn't know the full story. They swept floors and carried trays, laughing with each other. But sometimes, when the night grew too quiet, they'd say things like, "Did you hear that?" "Shh, no, but don't you think this place feels weird?" Because it did, not in a ghost kind of way, but in that heavy silence that buildings keep when they've seen too much. The older servants remembered more. The doorman with shaky hands, the kitchen girl who once whispered under her breath, the guard who had learned to walk without making a sound. They carried stories like secret maps.
They didn't always speak about it, but when they did, it wasn't about glory or power. It was about the nights when they felt small and scared, and somehow made it through. Every palace has its official history, the polished version with fancy words and carved stones. But the real history? That lives in whispers, in corners, in the quiet moments between footsteps. If you walk through the palace garden on a quiet night, you could almost imagine the people who once walked there before. A servant balancing a tray, hoping not to drop it. A guard standing too straight, trying not to breathe too loudly. A boy dreaming of escape. A girl just wishing to see another sunrise. Their names were never carved into stone, their faces never painted on grand walls, but they were the heartbeat of that palace. Rome loved to talk about emperors, about power, glory, wars, and victories. But history is more than emperors. It's built by the quiet hands no one writes about. And Caligula's palace? It remembered those hands. The Golden Chamber, once the center of everything, was now just another room. New rulers used it, new voices filled it, but every so often someone would pause in the middle of that shining floor and feel something cold crawl up their spine. No one could explain it, but the palace could. The old servants told stories in bits and pieces, never too loud, never too dramatic, just enough for the new generation to know that the palace had teeth once, sharp ones. A young servant once asked, "Was it really that bad?" The doorman only said, "Worse, but we learned how to survive." Then he closed his eyes, like someone hearing an echo no one else could. The city outside moved on fast. Rome was like that. It loved new emperors, new drama, new gossip. But the palace didn't move on so easily. It remembered everything. Every scream, every whisper, every night when even the walls seemed to flinch. Some nights the new servants lit their candles and told stories to each other in the laundry room. "Do you think he still haunts this place?" "Shut up!" "I'm serious." "No ghost, just history." And they were right. No ghost, just history. Heavy, quiet, stubborn history that never really goes away.
Over time, the whispers became part of the palace itself. People didn't talk about Caligula much anymore, but his name hovered like smoke that doesn't quite clear. The old rooms didn't need statues or scrolls to keep the past alive. They remembered in their own way. One spring morning, the palace had a new emperor again. New banners, new guards, new rules. The servants lined up in the courtyard to watch him ride in. He waved like all emperors do, like someone who believes the world will remember only him. But the palace knew better. It had seen them all. It had outlived them all. And it whispered to itself, "You'll just be another shadow on these walls." The doorman, now with white hair and slow steps, leaned against the gate and watched. He didn't bow too deeply. He didn't smile too wide. He had seen too much to be impressed by crowns anymore. Inside, the kitchen girl, now a woman, stirred a pot like she had every day for years. Someone asked, "Do you think this one will be worse?" She shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We'll survive." The palace seemed to nod in quiet agreement. When the night fell, the torches flickered and the marble floors glowed faintly under the light. It looked almost peaceful. But underneath that calm, 1,000 quiet stories lived. Stories of fear, of survival, of people who were never meant to be remembered, but were. The palace didn't cry for Caligula. It didn't cheer for the next emperor. It just existed, watching, listening, remembering. Because buildings, like people, carry memories. And this one carried some of the darkest whispers Rome had ever known. If you stood in those halls today, centuries later, you wouldn't hear screams, you'd hear silence. But it's the kind of silence that's thick, the kind that has weight. And that silence is history breathing. Not in books, not in monuments, but in the walls themselves. And maybe that's the truest ending. Not fireworks, not grand speeches, just a palace, still standing, still remembering. And the whispers of those who lived in its shadow still floating like smoke in the Roman night.